Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. So my presentation is on hypernovel diets and they cause diseases of civilization. And the subtitle is How Replacing Animal Source Foods with Refined Carbohydrates and Seed Oils Make Us Sick. So it's good that we had these presentations before mine because they went into detail. So I'll try to keep a broad overview. So first of all, not the fun stuff, conflicts of interest. I'm head of research for a medical clinic in Lisbon, Portugal, Clínica Pero, and we frame the way we do medicine with the evolutionary lens. And I'm also a consultant for a company called Zero Acre Farms, which sell an alternative product to high linoleic acid seed oils. So what happened? What's the story I'm going to tell you about today? So we start off with this original human diet. You can think that around 11,000 years ago, more or less, this is when we started to switch into a more modern diet. And, you know, a while later, hundreds of years, a few thousand years, we get diseases of civilization. So that's the path that I want to outline today. So the original human diet, what does it look like? What were we eating? So it was, I would argue, intermittently ketogenic, either because it was relatively low carb or because there were periods where maybe we didn't have as much food as we would have liked. I think it was pretty low in fiber. If we're also to look at the modern Hadza, even when they do eat root vegetables, they tend to spit out the fibrous parts, because they probably know there's not much nutrition in that. For a species like ours who has a short digestive tract, our anatomy is not one of fermentation. It's also a very nutrient-complete diet because it was heavily based around animal-sourced foods, and those, contain A, D, K, to a lot of the nutrients that we're missing today. It tended to be quite high in saturated fat, at least relative to today, so that's a big difference. And it was also very low in linoleic acid, the omega-6 linoleic acid you've heard a lot about. So what really distinguishes it is that it's very high in animal foods, especially compared to today's standards. We were and are, in fact, apex predators, arguably the most successful ones that have ever lived on the planet. So much so that, as my friend Mickey Bendor has argued, our hunting led to a decline in the size of the prey and the number of prey. We were so successful. So that's sort of the blueprint for how we ate thousands of years ago. So modern diets, what are they made of? Basically, it's sugar, flour, which are the refined carbs, and seed oils, especially the high linoleic acid seed oils. So those you might think of as the bad fats, really. So those you can think of them as the three devils in our diet. And of course, they've been replacing the calories that we used to obtain from animals, basically. So it's a low animal food diet in the truest sense. So these are really the main characteristics that you can see globally. When we look at modern diets, they all have this in common. And of course, when you can all think of the fact that fried foods really are the combination of this. There's not much animal foods in fried foods usually. There tends to be sugar, there's certainly flour, and they're mostly cooked in high linoleic acid seed oils, often for financial reasons rather than taste. So, low animal food diets. They're pretty much vegetarian diets. And there are problems with vegetarian diets. You have a lower stature. In populations eating high plant-based diets, they tend to be smaller. You lose strength on vegetarian diets, right? You get muscular weakness. You get worse immune function, poor immune function, so you tend to get sicker, you tend to get colds more easily. And especially if it's fed to young kids, you get neurodevelopmental issues, often because vegetarian diets are lacking in omega-3 and high in linoleic acid, by the way. And you also get maxillofacial developmental issues, unfortunately. And this is very evident if you look at Weston A. Price's work. You can see the shape of the face of people eating a traditional diet and people eating sugar, flour, and even seed oils. And it's quite striking, so I recommend you look up his book, Physical Nutrition Degeneration. So let's start talking about the problems with these processed foods. So the problem with flour and sugar, essentially it boils down to a couple things. The main ones for me are hyperinsulinemia, which Ben has talked about before, and hyperglycemia, so a rise in blood sugar. And this chart is actually showing you the relationship between the degree of processing of flour and the rise in insulin and blood sugar. And this happens because when you process flour, you get an increased rate of absorption of the sugars in your gut. So that's why if you drink sugar, you're also going to absorb them more rapidly, and this is going to spike your insulin and your blood sugar. Another problem with flour and sugar is that it essentially messes with your gut. It leads to something that we call endotoxemia. And this is when things that should not pass into your bloodstream go from your gut into your bloodstream. So this may happen because of gut dysbiosis, so a change in the bacterial composition, or it can happen because of imbalanced immune activation. And this is still a relatively new mechanism, so it's still being debated what is the primary cause behind it. Now, on to seed oils. We've heard a lot about them today, but I'll reiterate that at the fundamental level, I share the same view as Ben. It's a fat-centric problem. And this is because the linoleic acid content in seed oil interferes with the cell's job, the fat cell's job, which is to buffer energy. That's fundamentally what a fat cell does. It has to handle the incoming energy and release it appropriately. And the high level of linoleic acid interferes with this. So I've drawn on the left-hand side the effect of linoleic acid in the fat cell, and then you have something to contrast it on the right-hand side, which is the saturated fat. And I won't go into the complicated mechanism, but suffice to say, with linoleic acid, the fat cell remains insulin sensitive, and with the saturated fat, it remains insulin resistant. And we'll get into what this means later on. So another problem with seed oils is really the high level of toxic peroxidation or oxidation products. So malondialdehyde, which I can never pronounce, 4-HNE, and acrolein are three big ones that we see. And these will affect a range of diseases. So it oxidizes outside of your body when it's in the bottle and inside of your body. So there's really not escaping that issue with seed oils. So all of these problems really lead to a constellation of issues that we've called metabolic syndrome. Gerald Raven, in I think it was the 80s, where he came up with this term called Syndrome X initially. And you are deemed to have metabolic syndrome if you have at least 3 of these 5 issues: high fasting blood fat, high fasting blood sugar, low HDL cholesterol, abdominal obesity, and hypertension. So those are the hallmarks of metabolic syndrome. And these elements really, as we're going to see, lead to the diseases of civilization. So there are more. You could include PCOS and fatty liver in there, but these are the main ones I want to focus on today. So that's heart disease, cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and neurodegenerative diseases. So I'm going to tell you what I think these diseases are. What they're caused by. This is not necessarily what you will see if you ask your average clinician or even researcher, so please take this with a grain of salt. I think obesity is a disease of energy partitioning. It's not a disease of energy balance, of excess calories. And I think it's due to the dysfunction of the white adipose tissue, especially the one that you tend to see on your buttocks or your belly. So when something is going wrong there, your body is not able to partition energy as it should. And this is how I think obesity occurs, in humans at the very least. When you combine, and this can happen separately, but also in combination, there's probably a vicious cycle that happens when you combine them. So you can imagine that this essentially represents fried foods. Everyone pretty much agrees that fried foods are obesogenic, even if we don't agree about why. And I think that the refined carbs induce hyperinsulinemia, and the high linoleic acid seed oils induce fat cells to become overly insulin sensitive. And later on, I'll explore more in detail what this means. Onto cancer. This is also quite a controversial view on what cancer is, and cancer, as you may all know, is considered a genetic disease, fundamentally. I think it is not the case. I think it is a metabolic disease, and specifically because of mitochondria that are damaged, and they're damaged in a way where they cannot respire, meaning they cannot make ATP, they can't make energy using oxygen, as a lot of cells in our body do. I think that when a lot of linoleic acid is consumed, this integrates into a molecule called cardiolipin. And cardiolipin is really important. It's one of the major molecules in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Your mitochondria, which is where you make a lot of energy in your cells, uses these membranes to drive ATP generation. And when an excess of linoleic acid is consumed, you tend to damage these very fragile structures. And that means that the cell is not able to respire normally. So the cell protects itself by resorting to fermentation, where it doesn't need to use oxygen to continue to make energy. So this is another piece of evidence for why I think that dietary linoleic acid, so what you would consume in the seed oils mentioned by Chris Knobe earlier on, is likely to increase cancer mortality. This is a pretty old study from the end of 50s to the 60s, the LA Veterans Trial, and they showed that the experimental group with more linoleic acid likely had more deaths. Now, technically, this is not a statistically significant result, but I would not encourage you to ignore it, because I think that hopefully we'll have trials confirming that this is the case. But it's quite worrying when you see those figures. I think that cancer is also made worse by refined carbs, because like I said before, the refined carbs increase your insulin secretion beyond what is physiological, beyond what is normal. And this is very well known to spur tumor growth. You can inject insulin and spur tumor growth in animals. Refined carbs also worsen this fermentative phenotype that I mentioned. So you have these carbs that are absorbed rapidly. They increase insulin. And the increase in insulin is making the cancer cells relying on what they're best at, which is fermenting sugars, or even glutamine, which is an amino acid that can be fermented. So if you would have cancer, I'm not a clinician, but I would not recommend you keep consuming refined carbohydrates in any form. What you would want to do with cancer is hit it where it's weak. And if you force it to use oxygen, this will hurt the cancer cells and protect your normal cells, which are used to this way of making energy. So, onto type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is, as Ben was explaining, a disease of insulin resistance, specifically pathological insulin resistance. And once again, I think the issue is found in the adipose tissue, in the fat tissue, the white adipose tissue specifically. And once this dysfunction occurs, you become intolerant to carbohydrates. So how does this happen? How do we become pathologically insulin resistant? I think that with seed oils, in the short term, what we see is fat cells respond powerfully to insulin. They're very sensitive to the effects of insulin. This allows the fat cell to take up fat, take in more energy, and become progressively bigger and bigger and bigger. Over the long term, these cells, which balloon up, become hypertrophic. This leads them to be unable to meter out the fatty acids in an appropriate way. They're not doing this well anymore. They're leaking them, so your fasting insulin will go higher. There's a whole sorts of issues that happen when fat cells become too big. So this is why it's sometimes tricky when we look at the studies on linoleic acid and we see short-term there's a benefit, because when the fat cell can take up a lot of energy, we can see the blood glucose go down, we can even see increases in lean body mass, which is positive. But if we play this out over the long term, this is the cost that we're paying, to have overly sensitive fat cells. So if someone presents to you a study saying, hey, look, linoleic acid looks amazing, you have to be very skeptical and keep in mind the time frame in which it's presented and understand why this may be the case. I also think that refined carbs can directly cause hyperinsulinemia. And this is once again by hyperinsulinemia-induced insulin resistance. So I'll just make a quick note that insulin resistance is actually perfectly normal, physiological for humans when they're eating a normal low-carb or ketogenic diet. In fact, that's what you expect to happen. Your body receives less carbohydrate from your diet, so it needs to prioritize the glucose that it makes endogenously for the tissues, like, for example, your brain, which really rely on a significant amount of glucose. The pathological manifestation of that is when there's dysfunction in the fat cells. So try to keep in mind the difference between normal physiological insulin resistance and the pathological kind that comes from, these dysfunctional fat cells. So I know that can sometimes be confusing when you start a ketogenic diet or a low-carb diet, and there are distinctions that can help you understand this. So refined carbs, like I said earlier, cause endotoxemia. And endotoxemia itself can also lead to insulin resistance. So as you can see, we keep coming back to these same mechanisms through different ways where we can see that you have a large increase in pathological insulin resistance, whether through hyperinsulinemia or because there's a problem at the level of your gut. And I don't think anyone knows for sure the respective importance of each, but it seems that both actually matter. Okay, on to heart disease. So everyone here has probably heard of the hypothesis that heart disease is caused by LDL cholesterol. Or maybe if you're a bit more informed on the matter, you will say that it's because of the number of particles carrying cholesterol that cause heart disease. I think this is entirely wrong. In fact, I think it's a disease of clotting, meaning a response to injury. So there are many ways that you can injure your arteries, but fundamentally it's unicausal. It is a damage to the artery that has to be repaired. And this is visible if you look at a CAC score where it's measuring the amount of calcium in your heart. This is a sign of damage that has been repaired. So heart disease really is very much affected by your insulin levels. In fact, when you eat refined carbs, you'll get hyperinsulinemia, which will lead to pathological insulin resistance. And this is going to increase the oxidative stress in your mitochondria. So the oxidative stress, you can think of it, imagine you had this old car with a very sputtering engine that was making a lot of noise and not being very efficient. And eventually you're going to break the engine if you keep driving that car. That's kind of what's happening in the mitochondria of your cells. And this, of course, since these cells are in your arteries, right, in your heart, well, it injures the heart. Those cells die, they have to be replaced, repaired, and clotting occurs to make that happen. So there's another aspect of refined carbs leading to heart disease, and that's in relation to IGF-1. So refined carbs do increase serum IGF-1 levels, but there's also the IGF-1 levels that is transported in platelets. So imagine you injure your arteries, your platelets are going to come and try to reinforce the site of injury, right? You have a structural problem on a building, people come and try to repair the building. But if this happens continuously, your building is going to look kind of weird, and you're not going to be very trusting of going into that building. And essentially, your arteries start to thicken because it's constantly trying to be reinforced from these injuries that are happening. Could be because of air pollution, it could be because of seed oils, it could be for a lot of different reasons. And of course, we have linoleic acid always at the center of oxidative issues. And if you eat a lot of linoleic acid, so you consume seed oils that are high in linoleic acid, these will incorporate into the LDL particles. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of us still believe that cholesterol is at the heart, excuse the pun, of heart disease is because we've confused a normal, healthy LDL with an oxidized one, and we're conflating them, leading to a lot of confusion and lively debate on the matter. There's also an effect of linoleic acid, which increases clotting. And you can see this, for example, in fibrinogen levels. And fibrinogen is part of the clotting process to make sure that your arteries remain strong even after damage. And lastly, onto neurodegenerative disorders. So these include Alzheimer's. There's different types of dementia that accompany it. Parkinson's, of course. There's quite a few of them, and they're not easy to define because a lot of the symptoms overlap. But fundamentally, I believe that it's a disease of hypometabolism, meaning your brain cells aren't able to produce the energy they need in order to stay alive. And this damage that happens to the cell, so the cells can be neurons or glial cells, and essentially the damage propagates along specific networks. And the idea is that the damage along the specific networks will reflect the symptoms of the neurodegenerative disorder that the person is affected with. So here again, we have refined carbs and linoleic acid sort of creating the same problem but in different ways. I think they're both able to cause pathological insulin resistance, which itself increases mitochondrial oxidative stress. And that has been termed type 3 diabetes, or diabetes of the brain. So a lot of the problems that we've heard about before, you can apply the same problem in the brain. And that is one way that you can explain neurodegenerative disorders. So one of the issues with dietary linoleic acid is directly how it damages mitochondria. And there is a good argument to be made that it damages something called complex 1. Complex 1 is the blue complex that you can see on the left side here. If you're eating a lot of carbs, a lot of your energy is going to be shunted through this complex. And this, you can imagine this is a picture of an engine, and these are different parts of the engine. And depending on the fuel that you use, you're going to use different parts. It's like a hybrid car in that sense. So when there's damage to complex 1, this is very characteristic of the brain of people with neurodegenerative disorders. And this is why if we keep feeding them glucose, which is going to go majorly through complex 1, their symptoms are going to worsen, right? So if you keep feeding yourself refined carbs, you're going to keep using the same broken mitochondrial complex, and you'll fail to generate enough energy, enough ATP. So this is why a lot of people are finding symptomatic relief from a ketogenic diet on these disorders, although it's very early days, so we need bigger trials. And even with MCT oils, which bypass these broken complexes. So the idea with these disorders of hypometabolism is to get another way of making energy. You want to bypass complex 1, and that's why ketones, MCTs, ketogenic diets, fasting are so very interesting for these disorders. And lastly, linoleic acid, once again, its oxidation products can cause direct damage to neuronal and glial cell. So they degenerate and can't do their job anymore. So I've highlighted 4-HNE and MDA because they are some of the main ones implicated in the damage to these kinds of brain cells. Okay, so the takeaways I want to leave you with is that this dietary hyper-novelty, refined carbs, sugar, flour, led to this constellation of problems we call the metabolic syndrome. This metabolic syndrome is really at the base of all of these diseases of civilization that I've described. And as you can imagine, they're called diseases of civilization because they've only existed relatively recently when we started having civilized societies. So the main mechanisms of interest behind these diseases are pathological insulin resistance, which you can think of as type 2 diabetes, lipid peroxidation, so the problem with linoleic acid, high linoleic acid seed oils, and endotoxemia, when stuff that should stay in your gut ends up in your bloodstream. So those are the main mechanisms involved. And I want to give a special thanks to these people who've helped me come up with this way of interpreting the evidence. And this is a QR code if you want to explore some of the references that I've used for this presentation. Thank you.